My parents convinced me to let it go and move on, but behind my back they were preparing an even bigger betrayal. My name is Jason, and I'm a 29-year-old guy living in Dallas, Texas. I work as a civil engineer, and for the most part, I've built a decent life for myself here. However, there's something I need to get off my chest about my family situation, because what happened to me over the past several years has been eating away at me, and I'm not sure many people would believe it if I told them in person. I've been out of touch with my family for years now. It's not completely no contact, but it's close enough that I could easily go months, sometimes even a full year, without hearing from any of them. This wasn't always the case, though. Things started falling apart when I was in my early 20s, and it all began with what was supposed to be a simple favor that turned into a massive financial burden I had to carry alone. It started with a loan. At the time, my younger brother Kevin had this grand idea that he wanted to open a restaurant. Now, Kevin had absolutely no real experience running a business of any kind, but he could talk a big game and somehow managed to convince our parents that this was his lifelong dream. Our parents, being the supportive types they were, completely believed in him and his vision. That's when they came to me with their request. They asked me to co-sign the business loan for Kevin's restaurant. They made it sound like it was just a formality, nothing more than putting my name on some paperwork. They assured me that Kevin had investors lined up, a prime location already picked out, and what they described as a solid business plan. Most importantly, they promised me that they would step in financially if anything went wrong with the venture. I hesitated at first because something about the whole situation didn't feel right to me. But my parents pressed hard, really laying on the guilt about family loyalty and supporting each other's dreams. They kept emphasizing how this was Kevin's one shot at making something of himself, and how I was the only one who could help make it happen. Eventually, against my better judgment, I agreed and signed the papers. Less than a year after the restaurant opened its doors, the whole thing came crashing down. Kevin stopped making payments on the loan almost immediately after the business started struggling. But here's the part that really gets me. He didn't just fail at running the restaurant. He completely vanished from any sort of financial responsibility related to the business. He moved on with his life like nothing had ever happened, like he hadn't just left behind a massive mess for someone else to clean up. The bank, of course, didn't care whose dream the restaurant had been or who had actually run it into the ground. My name was on the paperwork, which meant I was the one they came after when the payment stopped. Suddenly, I found myself responsible for a debt that I had never wanted to take on in the first place, for a business I had no involvement in running. The next few years of my life were absolutely brutal. I ended up working 2 jobs just to stay afloat financially. I had to skip vacations, delay buying a house, and I burned through almost all of my savings just trying to keep my head above water and maintain my credit score. Every month felt like a struggle, and I was constantly stressed about money in a way I had never experienced before. I brought this situation up with my parents more than once, trying to get them to acknowledge how unfair the whole thing was. I explained how I had been lied to about the investors and the solid business plan, and how I was now the one cleaning up a mess that wasn't even mine to begin with. They never argued with the facts of what had happened, and they couldn't deny that I had been put in an impossible situation. However, every time I tried to hold them accountable for their promises and the situation they had put me in, they would deflect and turn it back on me. They would tell me that I needed to be the bigger person in all of this. They kept saying that family means making sacrifices for each other, and that I was somehow making things harder than they needed to be. It was incredibly frustrating because they were essentially asking me to just accept financial ruin for the sake of keeping the peace. Eventually, I just stopped trying to get through to them. I realized that no amount of reasoning or explaining was going to make them acknowledge what they had done to me. I didn't go completely no contact with them, but I definitely started keeping my distance. I would still show up for major events like weddings and holidays, and I'd attend the occasional birthday dinner when invited, but I never allowed myself to get too comfortable around them again. I stopped sharing anything personal about my life with them. I focused entirely on rebuilding my own financial situation and getting my career back on track. Slowly but surely, I managed to get my professional license back in good standing, and I started picking up better contracts at work. Most importantly, I learned a valuable lesson about not expecting fairness from people who consistently choose to protect the wrong person, even when that person is clearly in the wrong. This arrangement worked for several years. I maintained a polite but distant relationship with my family, and I was finally starting to feel like I had my life back under control. That's when things took an unexpected turn. A few months ago, my mother reached out to me with a phone call. She told me that my father's health had been declining, though she didn't give me any specific details about what was wrong with him. Instead, she started talking about how short life really is, and how important it is for families to try to make things right while they still have the chance to do so. She asked me if I would be willing to come over for dinner. Not for any special occasion or holiday, just a regular family dinner like we used to have when I was younger. She suggested that if I was open to the idea, we could make it a weekly thing, maybe every Tuesday evening. She made it sound like this was their way of trying to bridge the gap that had formed between us over the years. I didn't say yes right away. I wasn't entirely sure what making peace actually meant to them, or what they expected from me in return. But after thinking about it for a while, I figured I could at least give it one chance. Maybe things really had changed over the years. Maybe they had finally come to understand how badly they had handled the whole restaurant situation. Either way, I decided I would find out on my own terms. The first dinner was fine, I suppose. It had been years since I had seen Kevin, and true to form, he acted like absolutely nothing had ever happened between us. There was no apology for the financial mess he had left me to deal with. There was no acknowledgement of the loan or the failed restaurant at all. Instead, he just chatted casually about his current job, his wife, and what television shows he had been watching lately. It was surreal, honestly. I kept quiet during most of the evening. I didn't bring up any of the past issues or try to restart old arguments. Instead, I just observed the family dynamics and tried to get a sense of where everyone stood after all these years. What I noticed during that visit, though, really stuck with me. For starters, my childhood bedroom wasn't my room anymore. It had been completely cleared out and converted into what looked like a craft room or storage space. Nothing that had belonged to me remained in that space. Not my old bookshelf, not the drawings I had framed and hung on the walls, not even the sports trophies I had earned in high school. When I asked about it casually during the evening, my mother just shrugged and said, "We needed the space." There was no sentimentality, no explanation of what had happened to my belongings, just a matter-of-fact statement that they had needed the room for other purposes. Then there was a comment that Kevin's wife made during dinner that really stuck with me. She laughed while she was talking and made some offhand remark about how I had finally stopped holding a grudge against the family. I didn't respond to her comment at the time. I just smiled politely and kept eating my dinner, but internally I was taken aback by her assumption that I had been the problem all along. A few days after that dinner, my father approached me with what he described as a favor he needed help with. He explained that he was trying to get all of the family's estate documents properly organized and in order, and he wanted my assistance with sorting through everything. I agreed to help him, not because I had particularly high hopes about where this was leading, but because I was genuinely curious about whether this was their attempt to finally make things right with me. I was also interested to see just how far they were willing to go to repair our relationship. When he handed me a folder containing copies of their will, along with various property paperwork and insurance information, I started going through everything carefully. That's when I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. My name wasn't on any of the documents, not a single one. As I dug deeper into the paperwork, I discovered that about 5 years earlier, they had updated all of their estate documents. Everything, including the family house that I had actually helped renovate and contributed money toward when I was younger, had been left entirely to Kevin. There was no mention of me anywhere in their will or estate planning. I didn't react immediately when I saw this. Instead, I calmly asked my parents about it, trying to give them a chance to explain what I was seeing. My mother's response was that it was just a placeholder arrangement. She claimed that since I had supposedly cut ties with the family, they had simply assumed that I wouldn't want anything from the estate anyway. She said this as if it were a simple, innocent mistake that could easily be corrected. What really bothered me about her explanation was how she framed it, as if I had been the one who made the choice to walk away from the family. She completely ignored the fact that they had pushed me out over and over again, starting with the restaurant loan situation and continuing with their refusal to acknowledge how unfairly I had been treated. That conversation was a turning point for me. I started paying much closer attention to everything that was happening around me, but I didn't tell them what I was thinking or planning. I didn't start any fights or make any accusations. Instead, I began quietly digging into things because I wanted to understand exactly how deep this situation went. I needed to know how long they had been rewriting the truth about our family history. And more importantly, I wanted to find out exactly how much they had taken from me over the years. I had already spent several years of my life carrying a debt that wasn't rightfully mine. Now I needed to determine if there were other things they hadn't told me about, other ways they had used my name or my information without my knowledge or consent. At that point, I had no idea just how extensive their deception really was, or how much more I was about to discover. After seeing my name completely erased from the family will and hearing my mother casually explain it away like it was some kind of harmless placeholder, I knew that something was seriously wrong with this entire situation. I've always been cautious with my personal and financial life, especially after the fallout from co-signing that restaurant loan taught me some hard lessons about trusting people with my financial security. So I decided to reach out to a lawyer I had worked with before, a straightforward, no-nonsense guy who handles business contracts for the engineering firm where I work. I explained to him that I needed a quiet, thorough investigation into any past financial activity that might be tied to my identity, particularly during the years when I had minimal contact with my family. We started with basic records and background checks. Within just 2 weeks, he found something that absolutely didn't make sense. A joint bank account had somehow been opened using my social security number, but I had absolutely no memory of ever opening any such account. What made it even more suspicious was that the secondary name on the account wasn't mine either. It had been scrubbed from the records. My lawyer explained that he could get a subpoena to the bank that would reveal the complete details of who else had access to that account. That's when we discovered that this account had actually been flagged by the IRS in connection with unpaid taxes related to Kevin's failed restaurant. I had thought that particular debt had been completely cleared years ago, after I had paid everything that the bank had demanded from me. It turns out there was much more hiding beneath the surface that I had never been made aware of. Instead of immediately reacting or confronting anyone about what I had discovered, I decided to take a methodical approach. I started systematically gathering every piece of documentation I could find. I went through old letters, bank notices, and account statements that I had stored away over the years. I scanned everything and began creating a detailed timeline with notes, dates, and screenshots of every document. I was determined not to tip anyone off about what I was investigating. I wasn't ready for any kind of confrontation yet, because I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with before I made any moves. The scope of this situation was clearly much larger than I had initially thought. I decided to reach out to the accountant I had used during those difficult years when I was paying off the restaurant debt. Fortunately, he still had all of his records from that time period. When he pulled up my file, he found something that I had never seen before. A tax lien that had been filed just 2 years ago, tied to what appeared to be a second wave of unpaid business expenses from Kevin's restaurant. Here's the thing that really shocked me. I never received any notice about this tax lien. That explained why my application for a business line of credit had been quietly denied the previous year. I had assumed it was just because of normal credit evaluation procedures, but it turned out it wasn't about my income or work history at all. There was something attached to my name that I didn't even know existed. The very night I learned about the tax lien, I took immediate action to protect myself. I froze my credit with all 3 major bureaus, set up alerts for any attempts to access my credit report, and changed every password I could think of. I deleted online accounts that I no longer actively used, and I activated 2-step authentication across all of my important accounts. I also bought an external hard drive and backed up all of the evidence I had gathered so far, storing it offline where no one else could access it or accidentally delete it. I was starting to realize that this wasn't just a family dispute. This was potentially a serious legal matter. The next Tuesday, I went back to my parents' house for dinner as planned. I acted like everything was completely normal, like I hadn't seen the will, and like I didn't know anything about the mysterious joint bank account or the tax lien. Kevin was already there when I arrived, lounging comfortably in the living room like he owned the place. My father greeted me at the door with a warm smile and asked about how work was going. My mother was already in the kitchen setting the table for dinner. Everything seemed perfectly normal on the surface, but I was now paying attention to details in a way I never had before. During dinner, Kevin started talking about how grateful he was to our parents for all the support they had given him over the years. He mentioned that they had helped him through various hard times, completely ignoring the financial and legal mess he had left me to deal with when his business failed. The irony of him talking about their support while I was still dealing with the consequences of his failures was almost overwhelming. Then he mentioned something that really caught my attention. He casually brought up that our parents had bought him a new truck recently. His exact words were, They said I deserved it for sticking close to the family. He said this with genuine pride in his voice, completely unaware that I had been left to clean up his financial wreckage for years while he was being rewarded for his loyalty. Kevin's wife decided to join in on the conversation at that point. She laughed and made what she probably thought was a casual remark about how some people are always in the will and some people just drop off the map. It wasn't delivered as a joke. It was clearly intended as a pointed comment directed at me. She looked directly at me when she said it, making sure I understood exactly what she meant. Later in the evening, while everyone else was distracted by dessert and conversation, I quietly walked down the hallway toward the bedrooms. I slipped into what used to be Kevin's childhood room, which had apparently been converted into a small home office. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a desk, a filing cabinet, and some drawers for storage. I carefully opened the drawers, making absolutely sure to return everything exactly to how I found it. Inside, I discovered several folders that were neatly labeled and organized. One folder was dedicated to house-related documents, another was for insurance paperwork, and there was one that simply said "Power of Attorney" on the tab. As I flipped through these folders, I realized that every single document had been updated in recent years. Every one of them completely left out my name. There was no mention of me as a co-owner of any property, no listing as a beneficiary on any accounts, and I wasn't even listed as an emergency contact anywhere. Instead, all of the relevant boxes had been checked with Kevin's name, and in some places, his wife's name had been added as well. I used my phone to take photographs of everything, being careful to capture all the important details while making sure not to use the flash. After documenting everything, I quietly returned each folder to its exact position, shut the drawers, and stepped out of the room like I had simply been looking for the bathroom. When I got back home that evening, I immediately sent everything I had photographed to my lawyer. He called me that same night after reviewing all the documents and evidence I had gathered. He asked me directly if I was ready to move forward with legal action, because what I had uncovered was far more serious than either of us had initially anticipated. He explained that this wasn't just about the will or even about Kevin's new truck. The combination of these documents, along with the forged bank accounts we had already discovered, pointed to what appeared to be long-term identity misuse that could potentially rise to the level of criminal fraud. The systematic nature of how my name had been removed from everything while Kevin's had been added suggested this was intentional and coordinated, not just a series of innocent mistakes. The very next day, the phone calls started. I began receiving calls from unfamiliar numbers, one after another throughout the day. I made the decision to ignore all of them, letting them go straight to voicemail. One of the callers left a message saying that I owed over $35,000 in unpaid business taxes related to some kind of commercial entity I had never heard of. I recorded that voicemail message and immediately saved it before forwarding a copy to my lawyer. This was yet another piece of evidence that my identity was being used for financial obligations I had never agreed to take on. That same evening, I changed my phone number entirely, wanting to cut off this avenue of contact until I could figure out exactly what was happening. I also took the step of deactivating various online accounts that I hadn't used in years. Old email addresses, subscription services, social media accounts, anything that could potentially be tied to forgotten login credentials that someone else might have access to. I was starting to realize that if they had been using my information this extensively, there was no telling what other accounts or services might have been set up in my name. At that point, I decided I needed professional help to get to the bottom of this situation. I hired a forensic accountant to conduct a comprehensive trace of all financial activity that had been linked to my social security number over the past 10 years. I wanted a complete audit of everything. Every account, every application, every transaction that had my name or information attached to it. If my family had done this much damage in plain sight, I could only imagine what might be hidden deeper in the financial system. I was no longer willing to take their word for anything, and I needed to know the full extent of what I was dealing with before I decided how to proceed. Despite everything I was discovering, I still didn't confront anyone directly. I didn't make any angry phone calls or send heated emails demanding explanations. I wasn't going to give them any warning about what I had found or what I was planning to do about it. My strategy at this point was simple: trace everything, build an airtight case, and find out exactly who else might have been involved in using my personal information behind my back. The forensic accountant I hired worked quickly and thoroughly. When he finished the first comprehensive audit, He delivered a report that covered 8 full years of financial activity tied to my name and social security number. What he found was far worse than I had expected. According to his findings, 3 different credit cards had been opened without my knowledge or consent. Each one had been registered using my parents' old address as the billing location. All 3 cards had been used for what appeared to be basic household purchases, groceries, utility bills, and even some furniture payments. None of the individual purchases were massive by themselves, but when you added them all up over time, the amounts were significant. More importantly, all 3 cards had been maxed out to their credit limits and then sent into collections when the payments stopped. This explains some of the damage to my credit score that I had never been able to account for. But then there was a 4th credit card that was different from the others. This one had a much higher credit limit and had been opened just 2 years ago, much more recently than the others. When the forensic accountant showed me the transaction history, one particular charge stood out immediately. There was a large transaction for $11,000 that had been made as a down payment to an automotive dealership. The card had been maxed out shortly after that purchase and then shut down, just like the others. When I looked at the date of this transaction, it matched exactly with the day that Kevin had posted a picture of his new truck on social media. This was the same truck that he had proudly mentioned during dinner, claiming it was a gift from our parents for being the family member who stayed close to the family. It turned out that this gift had actually been purchased using a credit card that had been fraudulently opened in my name. I immediately froze my credit again, even though I had already done this once before. This time, I also added identity theft alerts through all 3 major credit bureaus and signed up for comprehensive credit monitoring services. I was determined to make sure that no additional accounts could be opened without my knowledge. I provided the complete forensic report to my lawyer, and he took the step of contacting the credit card companies directly to get more detailed information about how these accounts had been opened. One company responded quickly and provided something that was particularly damning. They sent us a copy of the driver's license image that had been submitted for account verification when the 4th credit card was applied for. The license had my name and all of my personal information printed on it, but the photograph wasn't mine. It was a grainy copy of someone else's face entirely. That's when my lawyer informed me that we now had enough solid evidence to proceed with a civil lawsuit. He also warned me that if we uncovered additional evidence during the legal process, this case could potentially lead to criminal charges for identity theft and financial fraud. Even though I now had enough evidence to move forward legally, I wasn't quite ready to make this into a full legal confrontation without giving them one more opportunity to come clean about what they had done. I didn't want this to become a legal ambush where they could claim they never had a chance to explain themselves or make things right. I decided to ask my father to meet me for coffee, telling him that I wanted to continue helping with the family estate planning paperwork we had discussed earlier. He readily agreed to meet, probably thinking that I was genuinely interested in being more involved with family matters again. We sat down at a quiet cafe, and I handed him a printed list that detailed all 4 of the credit cards that had been opened in my name, along with information about the IRS tax lien that I had discovered. I watched his face carefully as he read through everything, and he stared at the papers for a long time without saying much of anything. When he finally did speak, his response was disappointing but not entirely surprising. He said that everything had happened during what he described as a confusing time for the family, and that they had simply thought I had moved on with my life and wanted to maintain distance from them. He did admit that the bills and accounts were indeed in my name, but he tried to justify it by saying that they had been paid using what he called family funds, completely ignoring the fact that I had never agreed to any of this arrangement. When I pressed him specifically about the truck purchase and asked him to explain the fake driver's license that had been used for account verification, he looked out the window and gave me an incredibly vague response. He said that sometimes things get mixed up when people are just trying to help each other. He never admitted to anything clearly or directly. Everything was couched in vague phrases and attempts to redirect the conversation away from the specific evidence I had presented. That conversation was enough for me to realize that they weren't going to take responsibility for what they had done, even when confronted directly with proof. The next morning, I met with my lawyer and officially signed off on sending a cease and desist letter to both of my parents and to Kevin. The letter demanded an immediate stop to all use of my personal information, account access, and identity across any platform or service. It made clear that any further misuse of my information would result in immediate legal action. Copies of this letter were sent by regular mail, email, and were also served in person to ensure that there could be no claim that they hadn't received proper notice. A few days after the cease and desist letters were delivered, a mutual friend reached out to me. She told me that my mother had contacted her through an old landline phone, asking if she could somehow facilitate a conversation between my mother and me. My mother apparently wanted to speak with me just one last time to try to work things out. I told our mutual friend to relay a simple message back to my mother. I was no longer open to any kind of indirect communication or third-party mediation. If my family had something important to say to me, they could respond through the proper legal channels that had been established. Kevin, however, didn't wait for any formal legal process. Instead, he sent an email to an old work contact that we both shared from years ago, asking this person to forward a message to me. In his message, he called me dramatic and said that I was blowing things out of proportion. He claimed that lawyers weren't necessary for what he characterized as simple family disagreements. He wrote that I was always the one to hold a grudge against the family, and he actually joked that I must have been bored at work if I had enough free time to put this level of effort into what he saw as a minor issue. The tone of his message made it clear that he still didn't understand the seriousness of what he and my parents had done. I didn't respond to Kevin's message at all. I didn't even bother to read it a second time. I simply archived it in my email and forwarded a copy to my lawyer for our legal files. At that point, I had made my decision about how to handle any further communication attempts. After that incident, I turned my complete focus toward fixing the damage that had been done to my credit and financial standing. I activated comprehensive identity protection services that included real-time alerts for any attempts to access my personal information. I requested detailed account statements from all of the companies that had been involved in the fraudulent accounts. I began the tedious process of submitting official fraud reports, one by one, for every questionable debt, every collection notice, and every suspicious login attempt that I didn't recognize. Each report became a new case number in the system, and I started creating a digital folder to organize everything: PDFs of all correspondence, transcripts of phone conversations, copies of emails, and recordings of voicemails. Some of the banks and financial institutions were cooperative when I explained the situation and provided evidence of the fraud. Others pushed back initially, requiring additional documentation and proof before they would take action. For the companies that resisted, I filed official disputes through the proper channels and began building even more comprehensive documentation. I also hired a second firm that specializes specifically in digital forensics to trace every instance where my personal data had been accessed inappropriately over the past 10 years. If any online forms had been submitted using my name, social security number, or other identifying information, I wanted complete records of when, where, and how those submissions had been made. With every step I took in this investigation, the scope of what my family had done became harder and harder to ignore. This clearly wasn't just one mistake or even a small series of errors. It was layered, calculated, and had been sustained over many years. Each individual part of their scheme had been just small enough to pass unnoticed if you weren't looking for it. But when you put all the pieces together, they told a much larger and more disturbing story. This was a story of systematic identity theft that had cost me not just money and credit rating, but years of missed opportunities, access to financing, and most importantly, my ability to trust the people who were supposed to care about me most. The time for quiet observation and giving them the benefit of the doubt was rapidly coming to an end. I had let this situation go once before, years ago, when I decided to just keep my distance rather than fight them. But I wasn't going to let it happen again. Not now that I understood just how deep their deception really went. About a week after the cease and desist letters had been officially delivered, my lawyer forwarded me yet another notice that had arrived in his office. This time it was from a collections agency that I had never dealt with before, and they were claiming that I had an unpaid balance on a credit card that I had absolutely never opened or used. This particular account wasn't tied to household expenses or automotive purchases like the previous ones we had discovered. Instead, the charges listed on this statement were for software subscriptions, cloud storage services, and various vendor management tools. These were all things that I had never personally used in my life, but I recognized them from business contexts and professional environments. My lawyer immediately pulled fresh credit reports to investigate this new development, and we were able to trace this fifth credit card back to an account that was linked to some kind of business management software platform. Just like the others, this card had been opened using my name and social security number, But the billing address that had been used was my parents' old home address, the same property that Kevin had since taken over and now legally owned. What made this discovery particularly interesting was that the billing address had been updated to Kevin's current property shortly after the software account had been activated. This suggested that whoever was managing this account had been actively maintaining it and keeping the information current. We reached out to the software provider with the proper legal documentation, and they granted us access to detailed metadata logs from the account. Those logs revealed something that was absolutely damning. They showed Kevin's name and personal email address listed as administrative users on the account. Importantly, Kevin wasn't listed as the actual account owner on paper, but he had clearly been managing payments, user permissions, and all communications related to the account for nearly 2 years. The logs showed regular login activity from his IP address, along with timestamps that tracked when changes had been made to account settings and billing information. We took screenshots of everything we could access: timestamp records showing when changes were made, login history with IP addresses, detailed payment histories, and user permission logs. I gathered all of this evidence along with the collection letters, copies of emails, notarized statements from the collections notices, and recordings of the harassing voicemail messages I had been receiving. I backed up everything onto an encrypted external drive and stored it with a trusted friend who works in cybersecurity. I didn't want to rely solely on cloud storage for evidence this sensitive and important to my case. Then the phone calls from extended family members started coming in. These weren't from creditors or collections agencies this time. These were from relatives I hadn't heard from in years. People began reaching out through text messages and voicemails, and the tone of these communications was troubling. Some of the messages were passive-aggressive, while others were outright angry. One voicemail accused me of trying to humiliate the family over a few simple mix-ups. Another message claimed that I was weaponizing lawyers over basic misunderstandings. The language they were using made it clear that someone had been feeding them a very different version of events than what was actually happening. What struck me as particularly telling was that I hadn't told anyone in our extended family about the legal situation I was dealing with. The fact that these relatives were suddenly contacting me with such specific talking points meant that someone in my immediate family had been actively spreading their own narrative about the situation. That's when a cousin I used to be close with reached out to me privately. He said there was something I needed to see, and he sent me screenshots from a family group chat that I had apparently never been included in. This group chat had been running for years, covering family birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and other events, none of which I had ever been invited to participate in. The screenshots he shared with me were far worse than I had expected. My mother had been telling everyone in this group chat that I was emotionally unstable, difficult to communicate with, and had essentially cut off the entire family for no reasonable reason. She had been portraying me as someone who was impossible to please, constantly angry about everything, and who actively refused to return phone calls or show up for family functions. None of what she had been telling people was actually true. While I had certainly kept my distance from them over the years, I had never blocked anyone or refused to communicate entirely. I had simply stopped initiating contact and had become more selective about which family events I chose to attend. The narrative they had constructed was completely backwards from reality. There was much more disturbing content in those screenshots. Kevin had been consistently praised throughout these group conversations as the family member who had always stayed loyal and remained reliable. He was being portrayed as the rightful heir to family assets and the son who deserved everything he was receiving. One message that particularly stood out mentioned that Kevin had taken over their vacation property and deserved it after years of staying close and helping out. Another message actually stated that I had formally withdrawn any interest in the family estate, which was completely fabricated. That last claim stopped me in my tracks because I had never withdrawn interest in anything, formally or informally. I asked my lawyer to investigate property records related to this vacation home that was mentioned in the group chat. Through a private contact he had in real estate, we were able to trace the property transfer documents and discovered something shocking. A legal disclaimer had indeed been filed under my name, a document that stated I had no interest in claiming ownership of the property and had voluntarily forfeited any ownership rights I might have had. The problem was obvious. I had never signed any such document. We managed to identify the attorney who had handled the legal paperwork for this property transfer. The name was familiar to me. It was a family lawyer who had done some basic contract work for my parents years earlier. I decided to call the office directly, pretending to be a potential buyer who was interested in purchasing a share of the property for investment purposes. I explained that I wanted to review the complete legal documentation before making any kind of offer, and they agreed to send me a full document package. When the package arrived, I found exactly what I was looking for: a scanned form that had my name, address, and what was supposed to be my signature. The signature was clearly not mine. The handwriting was completely wrong. The loops were different, the letter formations were inconsistent with how I actually write my name, and the overall style was nothing like my real signature. It was obvious that this signature had been copied from some other document and reused on this property transfer form. We sent the questionable signature to a professional handwriting expert for analysis, and they confirmed what I already knew. It was definitely forged. The expert was able to determine that the signature had been traced or copied from another source, rather than being written naturally. At that point, my legal team updated our civil case to include additional charges: forgery, property fraud, and intentional misrepresentation. We organized copies of every document, email, and supporting message we had collected, and began preparing everything for an official legal complaint. My lawyer also began organizing all of our evidence for a potential criminal referral to the district attorney's office. We had moved far beyond the point where we needed to wait for anyone's permission to escalate this situation. We weren't going to wait for anyone's permission to escalate this situation any further. Meanwhile, Kevin's wife decided to post something deliberately vague on her social media accounts. It was just a black background with white text that read, "Family doesn't stab you in the back. Not unless they were never real family to begin with." The post immediately received supportive comments from various relatives who had absolutely no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. I didn't respond to her post in any way, but I did take screenshots of it and the comments for our legal files. It was yet another piece of evidence showing how they were trying to control the narrative and portray themselves as the victims in this situation. Not long after that social media post, one of my aunts reached out to me privately. She told me that she had always suspected something wasn't quite right about the family dynamics over the years, and she offered to provide an official statement if our case ever required additional witnesses. She explained that she remembered having conversations with other family members where certain details about me and my relationship with my parents just didn't add up, but no one had ever wanted to speak up against the rest of the family. At that point, I realized that my strategy of staying quiet and keeping my distance had actually been working against me all these years. Every lie that my parents and Kevin told about me had been able to fill the silence I had left behind. My absence from family gatherings and group communications had made it easy for them to rewrite history and paint me as the problem. So I made the decision to begin drafting a comprehensive digital folder that would set the record straight. This wasn't going to be a dramatic emotional plea or a lengthy explanation of my feelings. Instead, it would be a factual presentation. Legal documents, evidence logs, time-stamped screenshots, and dates. All written in clear, straightforward language for anyone who wanted to understand what was really happening. Once we had solid proof of forgery and multiple witnesses willing to testify on my behalf, I decided that this was no longer just about defending myself. It was time to take an offensive approach and hold them fully accountable for what they had done. After spending weeks finalizing all of our evidence with my lawyer, we sent out a formal notice of intent to sue. The legal letter specifically named my parents and Kevin as respondents in a lawsuit for identity theft, forgery, property fraud, and financial deception. The document detailed each individual infraction we had uncovered: 5 unauthorized credit cards, falsified tax documents, forged signatures on property transfers, and stolen property rights. Every single claim we made in that notice was backed up with concrete documentation, timestamps, bank records, and sworn statements from witnesses. We had been incredibly thorough in building our case. We made a deliberate choice about when to serve these legal papers. We decided to have them delivered on my father's birthday, ensuring that everyone in the family would likely be gathered together for the celebration. This wasn't about being cruel or vindictive. It was about making sure that there would be no way for them to deny receiving the documents or try to brush the whole thing off as some kind of miscommunication. The process server delivered 3 separate packets that afternoon: one to my parents at their home, one to Kevin at his address, and one to the family lawyer who had filed the fraudulent vacation home documents on my behalf without my knowledge or consent. By that evening, My email inbox and phone were completely flooded with activity. I received dozens of missed calls, voicemails, and text messages from cousins, uncles, aunts, and even people I hadn't spoken to since high school. Some of these people were asking what was going on and seeking clarification about the situation. Others were absolutely furious, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart over what they saw as minor issues. A few relatives sent messages hoping that I would somehow find a way to forgive and move past all of this. It was clear that word about the lawsuit had gotten out quickly throughout the extended family. But based on the tone and content of these messages, it was obvious that people weren't getting the complete truth about what had actually happened. That's when I decided to send out the comprehensive digital folder I had been preparing. I created a password-protected link and sent it to key family members who had reached out to me. Inside this folder was a complete timeline of events, scanned copies of all relevant documents, forensic accounting reports, screenshots from the family group chat I had never been included in, property filing documents showing the forged signatures, and side-by-side comparison overlays from our handwriting expert. Everything in the folder was organized chronologically with specific dates, proper context for each piece of evidence, and legal reference numbers where applicable. I made sure to use completely factual, unemotional language throughout the entire presentation. There were no personal rants, no emotional appeals, just clear data and documentation. Within just a few hours of sending out this evidence folder, the family group chat that had been running for years began to completely break down. Messages started leaking out to people who weren't supposed to see them, and the carefully constructed narrative that my parents had been maintaining began to fall apart under the weight of actual evidence. A few relatives quietly reached out to me personally and apologized for believing the version of events they had been told over the years. They admitted that they should have asked more questions instead of just accepting what they were hearing secondhand. However, others doubled down on their original position, insisting that I was somehow ruining our family's reputation and good name. One cousin even went so far as to accuse me of becoming the type of person who would sue their own parents just to get attention and cause drama. That same night, my father left me a voicemail message. In it, he said that the lawsuit was a disgraceful display and complained that this was something we should have handled like men, face-to-face, rather than involving lawyers in the court system. What was telling about his message was that he didn't deny any of the specific allegations or evidence we had presented. He didn't try to dispute the forged signatures, the fraudulent credit cards, or the stolen property rights. Instead, he just complained about what he called the optics of the situation and insisted that this was a family issue that didn't belong in a courtroom. I forwarded that voicemail recording directly to my lawyer, and it became part of our official documentation. It served as evidence showing a complete lack of remorse or accountability on their part, even when confronted with overwhelming proof of their wrongdoing. The next day, a cousin I hadn't seen in over a decade showed up at my front door unannounced. She handed me an envelope and simply said, "This is from your mother." Inside was a handwritten letter where my mother said that families make mistakes and begged me to please stop this before it's too late. I didn't bother reading beyond those first few lines. I told my cousin to let my mother know that I was no longer accepting any kind of indirect messages or third-party communication. I had made my boundaries crystal clear through legal channels, and I wasn't going to walk back on those boundaries now. That same evening, Kevin decided to post something on his social media accounts. He shared a picture of himself with our parents at what looked like a backyard barbecue, all of them smiling broadly at the camera. The caption he wrote read, "It's sad when family turns against you for no reason. Some people live to create chaos." His post was immediately flooded with likes and supportive comments from people who had absolutely no idea what was really happening behind the scenes. What struck me most about his post was that there wasn't a single mention of the lawsuit, not one word about the stolen identity or forged documents, and no acknowledgement whatsoever of the concrete evidence that had been presented against him. A few people from my college years and others from an old job reached out to me after seeing Kevin's post, or hearing bits and pieces of the story through mutual friends. I sent each of them the same response. A simple summary file containing the basic facts, legal reference numbers, and copies of key court filings. I kept everything completely factual and unemotional, just clean information that could speak for itself and put an end to any speculation. My workplace also got wind of what was happening, which wasn't entirely surprising given how quickly news can spread in professional circles. My manager pulled me aside for a private meeting to discuss the situation. I brought along a copy of our complete legal packet and a written summary of everything that had transpired. After reading through all the documentation, my manager told me that I had the firm's full support and that my role would not be affected in any way by the ongoing legal proceedings. They also implemented new protocols to ensure that no press representatives or third parties would be able to get access to any of my internal work information, helping to keep this legal process from taking over my daily professional life. I made the decision to give full power of attorney to my lawyer for all legal matters related to this case. He would handle all court filings, communications with opposing counsel, and case updates going forward. I would check in with him weekly to stay informed about major developments, but the day-to-day legal work would proceed without requiring my constant involvement. I realized that I couldn't effectively build my future while being constantly dragged through every minute detail of this painful past. I needed to maintain some separation between my daily life and this legal battle. A few weeks later, the court officially accepted our case for a full trial. The judge reviewed all of our evidence and documentation and approved the case to proceed through the complete legal process. As part of the discovery phase, subpoenas were issued for archived emails, property transaction logs, and security footage from the notary office where the deed transfer had allegedly taken place. The court also requested detailed bank logs to trace all payments that had been made on the fraudulent accounts, along with records showing exactly who had authorized those transactions and when they had occurred. That's when the carefully constructed narrative that my family had been maintaining for years really started to unravel. The legal documents didn't match the stories they had been telling people. The signatures on official paperwork didn't match the identification records on file. The bank transaction logs didn't align with the names of people who were supposed to have authorized the payments. All of the lies and half-truths they had used to build their version of reality began to collapse under the scrutiny of proper legal investigation. What they had been characterizing as simple family drama was being systematically exposed as something much more serious and deliberate. I realized that the next phase of this process wasn't just going to be a standard legal battle over money and credit scores. This was going to be a complete reckoning between the people they had pretended to be for years and the truth about what they had actually done to me behind my back. A few weeks before our scheduled trial date, the court issued a mandatory mediation order. This was essentially the last chance for both sides to reach some kind of resolution before the case proceeded to open litigation in front of a judge and potentially a jury. My lawyer advised me to attend this mediation session, not because he thought there was any real possibility of reconciliation, but because he wanted to observe their legal strategy and lock in our own pretrial approach based on how they chose to present their case. We met at a neutral office building downtown, where a professional mediator had been assigned to oversee the process. Private conference rooms were prepared for both sides to use during breaks and strategy discussions. My parents arrived with a completely new attorney, someone who came from a reputation management background rather than traditional family law. His approach was polished but immediately aggressive. He opened the mediation session by accusing me of attacking my own family out of spite and dragging old wounds into the public eye for no legitimate reason. He claimed that I was deliberately misinterpreting what he characterized as harmless paperwork, and that I had taken things much too far by involving lawyers and the court system. His entire opening statement was designed to make me look vindictive and unreasonable. Kevin sat next to their new lawyer, remaining mostly silent at first. But eventually he spoke up, saying that everything we were discussing was just a big misunderstanding, and that I was making a huge deal over what he described as shared family resources. His tone suggested that he genuinely believed he had done nothing wrong. My lawyer responded to their opening statements with a prepared slideshow presentation. Each slide contained digital records, IP logs that were specifically tied to Kevin's personal devices, banking timestamps showing exactly when payments and account setups had occurred, and documents that traced everything back to their home address. The final slide in our presentation showed a side-by-side comparison of my actual signature with the forged signature that had been used on the property disclaimer. The differences were obvious and clear, even without needing a professional handwriting expert to point them out. Their attorney asked for a 15-minute break halfway through our presentation. During this pause, while I was walking past the vending machines in the hallway, I happened to overhear my father talking to my mother in a lowered voice. He was actually blaming her for the entire situation, saying something like, "This would never have gotten this far if she hadn't kept pushing paperwork around without asking anyone first." I didn't say anything or react to what I had overheard. I simply walked back into our conference room and documented the conversation for our legal team. The mediator wrapped up the session by formally stating on the record that reconciliation was not possible between the parties. His official report was submitted to the court with a clear recommendation to proceed to full trial without any further attempts at mediation or settlement. As the mediation session ended and we all stepped out into the hallway, Kevin actually tried to stop me before I could leave the building. He reached out toward me and began to say something about clearing the air between us and finding a way to work things out. I didn't respond to him at all. I kept walking toward the exit without acknowledging his attempt to engage me in conversation. As soon as I got to my car, I immediately alerted my legal team about this interaction. From that point forward, I made it absolutely clear that all communication would remain strictly documented and would only go through our attorneys. Later that same evening, one of my cousins messaged me again with a new batch of screenshots from the family group chat. My mother had posted a lengthy message in the chat accusing me of always needing to outshine Kevin and being addicted to attention and drama. She claimed that I had always been jealous of Kevin's success and was now using lawyers to get revenge on the family. Several family members had responded to her message with supportive reactions and comments agreeing with her assessment of my character. I saved all of these screenshots because the language my mother was using would later help support the emotional impact portion of our legal case. Following my lawyer's suggestion, I began writing out a detailed timeline of events from my past that showed a pattern of exclusion and manipulation. I documented every time I had been deliberately left out of family decisions, every instance where I had been manipulated into taking on financial responsibility for other people's choices, and every occasion where I had been dismissed or blamed when I tried to address these issues. I included specific details from my teenage years, family investments that I had contributed money toward, renovation work I had helped complete on family properties, and countless examples of how I was consistently labeled as the one who never came through, even when I had actually followed through on my commitments. Around that same time, a small regional blog that focuses specifically on family-related fraud and identity theft reached out to my legal team. They were interested in doing an interview or getting a statement from me about the case, since it was becoming a notable example of how identity theft can happen within families. I declined to do any kind of personal interview, but I did allow my lawyer to provide them with a factual, neutral summary of the case without any speculation or personal commentary. The article was published the next day with the headline, "Engineer's Identity Hijacked by Own Family. Legal Case Exposes Hidden Abuse." That article circulated quietly but steadily through online communities focused on financial fraud and family abuse. Within just a few days of its publication, Kevin's employer placed him on administrative leave. No official announcement was made by the company, but someone forwarded me a copy of an internal memo citing reputational concerns related to ongoing legal proceedings. It wasn't a termination, but it was clearly a signal that his professional reputation was being affected by the criminal nature of our case. Out of nowhere, a childhood friend I hadn't heard from in several years reached out to me. He said that he had followed the story through the blog article and some social media posts, and that looking back on our shared history, he now realized how often my family had portrayed me as being difficult or problematic. He apologized for believing their characterization of me over the years without questioning it, and he offered to write an official statement for our legal case if it would be helpful. I accepted his offer and connected him directly with my lawyer so he could provide his testimony about the family dynamics he had observed during our childhood. 2 former neighbors also contacted me during this period. They had been present during major renovation projects at the family home when I was in my early 20s, repairs and improvements that I had both paid for and helped coordinate personally. They remembered me showing up every weekend with construction materials and contractors, working alongside the professionals to get the job done. Their statements directly contradicted the version of events that my parents had submitted in their earlier legal filings, where they had claimed that I had never contributed financially or physically to any family property improvements. While all of this was unfolding around me, I deliberately buried myself in my work projects. I took on a new assignment designing transitional housing facilities for youth who were aging out of the foster care system. This project wasn't just a distraction from the legal proceedings. It was something that reminded me of the value of creating structure, stability, and building things that are designed to last and help people. As our trial date approached, more reporters began requesting interviews and statements from me about the case. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years started resurfacing with messages, each asking essentially the same question. How did this situation get so out of control? But I wasn't interested in explaining myself or my family's behavior to the media or to people who were just curious about the drama. I had proof of what had happened. I had witnesses willing to testify on my behalf. I had statements from experts, records from financial institutions, and a legal team that was fully prepared to present our case in court. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was actively working to put a complete stop to something that my family thought they could get away with indefinitely. I was establishing clear boundaries where none had existed before, and this time, their silence and manipulation tactics wouldn't be able to work against me. The court gave us exactly 60 days after finalizing our trial date to complete all of our preparations. We had 60 days to lock in our final witness list, organize every single piece of documentation we had collected, and submit our completed forensic reports to the court. Over the past several months, my legal team had expanded our case files significantly. We had collected hundreds of pieces of evidence, email correspondence, bank statements, expert analysis reports, screenshots of social media posts, and signed affidavits from multiple witnesses. But then something completely unexpected landed in our lap just as we were beginning to prepare our final submission to the court. A retired financial advisor reached out to us through my attorney's office. He explained that he had worked with my parents years ago, back when their original estate plan was first being drafted and implemented. He said that he still maintained copies of some older trust documents in his personal archives, and one particular file had stood out to him when he heard about our case. He had kept a notarized affidavit from my father that had been signed over a decade ago. This document clearly stated that the family's vacation property would be jointly owned by both of his sons, myself and Kevin, rather than being left to just one of us. When we reviewed this document, we found that it had clear notary stamps, properly dated signatures, and had been professionally prepared according to all legal standards. Most importantly, it directly contradicted the current property deed, which now listed Kevin as the sole legal owner of the vacation home. That single document was enough to trigger an immediate court motion. My lawyer filed it that same day, and the judge quickly approved a temporary freeze on the vacation property. This meant that no selling, transferring, refinancing, or restructuring of the property could take place until our case was completely resolved. Kevin's legal team tried to challenge our case once again. This time, they argued that the statute of limitations had expired on our claims, and that any documents older than 5 years should be considered irrelevant to the current proceedings. They were essentially trying to get our case thrown out on a technicality. However, the judge disagreed with their argument completely. The court ruled that due to the ongoing nature of the fraud and the fact that much of it had been deliberately concealed from me, our claims remained fully valid under the law. The motion to dismiss our case was denied, and we were cleared to proceed to trial. The deposition phase began shortly after that ruling. During my mother's sworn testimony, she actually admitted under oath that she had known about several of the credit cards that had been opened in my name. When asked directly about her knowledge of these accounts, she said that she thought it wasn't a big deal because the money had been used for household needs and family expenses. The court transcript recorded her exact phrasing, and my lawyer immediately flagged this admission as crucial evidence. That single statement transformed what they had been characterizing as an innocent misunderstanding into something that they had knowingly allowed and participated in. In a follow-up hearing, the judge directly addressed both of my parents about the inconsistencies between their previous financial records and their current sworn statements. Tax filings, banking documents, and estate records were not aligning with what they had told the court under oath. The judge issued a formal warning to them, making it crystal clear that if any further discrepancies were uncovered during the trial process, serious sanctions would follow. The pressure on them was clearly mounting as their stories continued to fall apart under legal scrutiny. The turning point came when the notary who had supposedly witnessed my signature on the vacation home deed transfer was subpoenaed to testify. She appeared via video conference for her sworn testimony, and what she revealed was absolutely damning. She confirmed that she had never actually met me in person. She explained that she had notarized a stack of papers that had been given to her by my father, and that my signature was already present on all of the documents when she received them from him. She was simply adding her notary seal to papers that had been pre-signed. That testimony, combined with our expert handwriting analysis, provided definitive proof that the property deed was a forged document. There was no longer any room for interpretation or alternative explanations. This revelation caused a significant shift in our case. The district attorney's office requested access to our complete court files for review. What had begun as a civil lawsuit between family members was now being examined for potential criminal charges including fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Then we received another unexpected piece of evidence. My attorney received an anonymous email from someone claiming to be a former employee of Kevin's failed restaurant. The message stated that my name had been used to open vendor accounts, place orders for supplies, and negotiate payment terms with various distributors during the time the restaurant was operating. Attached to this email was a photograph of a vendor application form. The name on the application was definitely mine, but once again, the signature was completely wrong. The handwriting was inconsistent and sloppy, bearing no resemblance to how I actually signed my name. We forwarded this new evidence to the court and added it to our growing list of instances where my identity had been misused without my knowledge or consent. The pattern of systematic identity theft was becoming impossible to deny. After our court filings became part of the public record, the ripple effects throughout our extended family became more pronounced. Some relatives who had previously supported my parents began changing their position as the evidence mounted. A few reached out to me quietly, offering to provide statements or copies of old messages that contradicted what my family had been claiming about me for years. One cousin came forward with something particularly direct and damaging. He told us that years ago, his mother had confided in him that I had been deliberately removed from the family will because I was too independent and wouldn't fall in line like the younger one. This admission confirmed what I had suspected for a long time. This wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about control and punishment for building a life outside of their expectations and manipulation. With each new piece of evidence that surfaced, the carefully crafted story my family had been telling about me began to completely collapse. Their version of events, where I had supposedly walked away from the family, refused their help, and turned bitter over minor disagreements, was falling apart under the weight of facts and sworn testimony. The media began picking up larger pieces of the story as more documents became publicly available through court filings. What had once appeared to be a private family dispute was now recognized as a substantial legal case with broader public interest and the potential for serious criminal charges. Reporters started asking more detailed questions about the case. Local blogs began running comprehensive summaries of the evidence. Behind the scenes, state authorities began reviewing the case more closely to determine whether additional investigation was warranted. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, there was no way for my family to spin the narrative in their favor. The paper trail was clear and undeniable. Their lies had been caught and documented. The damage they had caused was fully exposed, and it could no longer be ignored, minimized, or explained away with vague excuses. True accountability wasn't just a possibility anymore. It was actually happening, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The court issued a comprehensive protective injunction that barred my parents and Kevin from making any changes to their financial or property assets until our case was completely resolved. This meant absolutely no selling, no refinancing, no restructuring of accounts, and no transferring of ownership for any properties or investments. The vacation property remained locked under the court's freeze order, and my lawyer filed for active monitoring of any attempted movement or changes across all related bank accounts and financial instruments. Within just days of the injunction being issued, Kevin was served with an official notice informing him that a formal criminal investigation had been opened by the district attorney's office. The charges currently under review included identity theft, document forgery, and financial fraud, all of which could result in significant jail time if he were to be convicted. Less than 48 hours after Kevin received that criminal investigation notice, he attempted to contact me through a mutual acquaintance we both knew from years ago. The message he tried to send was a private offer to settle everything quietly out of court in exchange for me agreeing to drop the criminal portion of the case. I immediately forwarded Kevin's settlement message to my lawyer, who submitted it directly to the court as evidence. The judge logged this attempted contact as a potential act of witness tampering and issued a stern warning to the opposing counsel that any further attempts at indirect contact with me would be taken very seriously by the court. That settlement offer and warning became part of our official case timeline, serving as additional evidence of their desperation and intent to avoid formal accountability through the legal system. The local media picked up our story next, and it spread quickly. The initial headline read, "Man accuses family of years-long identity theft in explosive civil suit." A follow-up article highlighted the broader impact of the case, detailing how years of silent financial sabotage had destroyed my credit rating, delayed my ability to purchase property, and cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees and financial recovery efforts. The story gained traction fast, and soon my workplace began receiving inquiries from reporters wanting to know more about the case and get additional comments. My firm responded professionally with a brief internal memo and a public statement confirming their full support for me throughout this legal process. They also reminded all staff that internal discussion about the matter was strictly prohibited, and HR confirmed that I would be protected from any press contact during work hours. They even offered additional legal assistance if outside pressure or media attention escalated to a level that might interfere with my job performance. Meanwhile, the retired financial advisor who had initially helped draft the original estate documents submitted a signed deposition to the court. In his sworn statement, he confirmed that I had personally provided funds toward the down payment for the vacation home over a decade ago. His detailed records included a copy of a personal check that I had written, addressed to the same title company that had handled the original property purchase. That check directly contradicted the current legal claim that I had never been financially involved in acquiring the property. In response to this new evidence, the court placed a formal lien on the vacation property pending a complete reassessment of the rightful ownership. This meant that even after our case was resolved, the property couldn't be sold or transferred until the ownership question was definitively settled. Kevin tried to fight back through public relations efforts. He recorded a video statement and posted it across multiple social media platforms, portraying himself as the victim of a vindictive family member. He claimed that the entire lawsuit was built on bitterness and painted a picture of himself as someone who was simply being misunderstood and unfairly targeted. However, his attempt to shift public sympathy in his favor completely backfired. Online commenters and investigative bloggers began digging into his background and posting their findings. Old records surfaced about his failed restaurant, including documentation of unpaid debts and past disputes with former vendors and business partners. His attempt to control the narrative and gain public support only added more fuel to the truth that was already catching fire across social media and local news outlets. A new witness came forward during this period. A former landlord contacted my legal team with documents showing that a rental lease had been signed using my identity several years ago. The lease application included fake employment information and forged pay stubs that had been submitted in my name. The address listed on this fraudulent lease was a property that Kevin had used while he was running his short-lived business ventures. The landlord had kept all of this paperwork for tax record purposes and was willing to testify under oath that I had never lived at that address and had never personally applied for the rental unit. The court accepted this new witness testimony, and the lease agreement was added to our fraud timeline as yet another example of identity theft. Our case now officially covered almost 10 full years of stolen identity, misused credit, and forged documentation, all pointing back to the same group of individuals and supported by an extensive trail of evidence. Then my father was hospitalized due to a cardiac issue. Almost immediately, several family members began reaching out to me through various third parties, urging me to drop the legal case out of compassion and asking me to remember what family really means during this difficult time. I declined to respond to any of these indirect appeals. Instead, I passed all contact attempts directly to my attorney, making it clear that nothing had changed regarding my position. My father's health problems didn't erase what had been done to me over the years, and they certainly didn't restore the credit, opportunities, and trust that had been taken from me. The judge reviewed the pattern of continued interference, the mounting testimony, and the ongoing attempts at manipulation that were still happening even during active legal proceedings. Citing the urgent need to prevent any further tampering with witnesses or evidence, the court made the decision to fast-track our trial date. Discovery deadlines were shortened significantly, and priority status was given to obtaining communications between Kevin and his legal representation, including any attempts they had made to contact potential witnesses or influence testimony. To strengthen the emotional damages portion of our claim, My lawyer submitted a comprehensive psychological evaluation report that had been prepared by a licensed therapist. The report detailed the long-term psychological effects of gaslighting, deliberate emotional exclusion, and repeated betrayal by people who were supposed to be trustworthy family members. The evaluation outlined the mental and emotional toll of having one's financial identity slowly erased and destroyed, while simultaneously being painted as the problematic family member who was responsible for all the dysfunction. It provided professional documentation of the psychological damage that had been caused by years of systematic manipulation and financial abuse. Our case now officially listed identity theft, property fraud, emotional abuse, and reputational harm as the primary charges. Each count was thoroughly backed with concrete records, expert testimony, and professional validation from multiple sources. There was no longer any version of events, no matter how creatively constructed, that could protect my family from the consequences of their actions. Not legally, not socially, and not even within our extended family, who were now able to see through the years of carefully crafted falsehoods and manipulative narratives. As our trial date approached, I focused entirely on mental and emotional preparation for what was to come. Everything had fundamentally shifted from where this journey had started. I wasn't entering that courtroom just to win financial damages or get my credit score restored. I was walking into that trial to take back my name, my reputation, my financial identity, and my personal story. I was reclaiming every piece of myself that they had tried to rewrite, manipulate, or erase over the years. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about truth, accountability, and making sure that what they had done to me could never happen to anyone else. The trial opened with my legal team presenting a comprehensive timeline that covered nearly a decade of documented evidence. The courtroom's projection system displayed a series of slides, one after another, systematically linking dates, forged signatures, duplicate financial records, and sworn witness statements. The presentation included notarized documents, screenshots of altered emails, detailed IP address logs, comprehensive bank statements, and official reports from multiple witnesses. Every single detail had been time-stamped, every claim was supported by a clear paper trail, and every piece of evidence had been verified through multiple sources. The courtroom was completely silent as the evidence was presented. You could feel the weight of what was being revealed settling over everyone present. Kevin was called to the witness stand first. He started his testimony by insisting that everything had been a big misunderstanding, that no harm had been intended by anyone involved, and that all of these issues had occurred during what he characterized as a particularly difficult time for the family. But when my lawyer began his cross-examination and asked Kevin directly to explain how my name had ended up on business lease applications, vendor account agreements, and credit card applications that he had clearly benefited from, Kevin paused for a long moment. When he finally answered, his response was devastating to his own case. He said, "It was easier to use his information, he wasn't using it anyway." Those words hit the courtroom like a hammer blow. There was no denial, no elaborate excuse, no attempt to claim ignorance. Just a straightforward admission that he had deliberately stolen my identity because it was convenient for him. When my mother was called to testify, she attempted to take what she probably thought was the emotional high road. She claimed that she had only done what she felt she had to do to help her younger son during his time of need. She insisted that families are supposed to make sacrifices for each other, and that everything had been about survival rather than causing harm to anyone. The judge cut her off mid-sentence during this testimony. He reminded her firmly that helping one child by systematically defrauding another child was not sacrifice, it was criminal facilitation. Her face visibly fell when the judge used those words, and she said absolutely nothing else for the remainder of her time on the witness stand. The notary who had allegedly witnessed my signature on the vacation home deed transfer gave her testimony next. She confirmed once again that she had notarized the property documents at my father's specific request, but that she had never actually met me in person at any point during the process. She admitted that she hadn't asked appropriate questions when she was presented with forms that already had signatures on them, and she now deeply regretted not following proper verification procedures. Her testimony sealed the fate of the property transfer. It was definitively proven to be fraudulent. Based on the confirmed forgery, the judge immediately ruled that the vacation home deed was completely void. The property ownership was restored according to the original estate affidavit that the retired financial advisor had provided. which clearly stated that both Kevin and I were intended to be joint owners. Kevin was ordered to pay back rent and usage penalties dating all the way back to when the property had been falsely transferred into his name exclusively. The financial impact of this ruling alone was substantial, but it was just the beginning of the consequences he would face. Shortly after the property ruling, my legal team submitted verified letters from multiple credit reporting bureaus. Based on the court's official findings of fraud, all of the fraudulent accounts that had been opened in my name were flagged and completely removed from my credit history. My credit score was fully restored to where it should have been, without the years of fraudulent damage. All debt associated with those accounts was permanently erased from my record, and the credit agencies issued formal written apologies for the years of damage that their systems had allowed to persist. That same day, the district attorney's office made an official announcement that criminal charges were being filed against Kevin for identity theft, financial fraud, and falsifying legal documents. Both of my parents were also placed under formal investigation for conspiracy and financial misconduct related to their role in facilitating and covering up Kevin's crimes. A separate criminal review process would proceed parallel to our civil case, meaning that even after our lawsuit was concluded, the criminal justice system would pursue its own charges and penalties. When it came time for the judge to deliver his final ruling in our civil case, the decision was comprehensive and decisive. I was awarded $195,000 in total damages. This amount included coverage for emotional harm, lost opportunities, legal expenses, and career setbacks that had been caused by the credit destruction and false reputation that had followed me for years. Before officially closing the session, the judge took the unusual step of addressing the entire courtroom with some personal remarks. He said that family loyalty should never be used as an excuse for betrayal, and that protecting one person by systematically harming another family member isn't love. It's abuse, hiding behind the facade of tradition and family values. When the court session officially ended, I handed my lawyer a final list that I had prepared in advance. Every family member who had testified against me, who had enabled the fraud in any way, or who had knowingly passed along misinformation about me over the years was to be permanently removed from my life. I made it clear that contact would not be restored with any of these people, not now, and not at any point in the future. My lawyer sent out an official notice stating that any attempts to reach me through any means would be treated as harassment and would be immediately forwarded to the appropriate legal channels. Within 1 week of the judge's verdict, I made the decision to list my share of the vacation property for sale. When it sold, I donated a significant portion of the proceeds to a nonprofit organization that specifically supports identity theft survivors. This organization helps people rebuild their lives from scratch, both financially and emotionally, after having their identities stolen and misused. It felt absolutely right to support something that addresses the exact type of devastation that had nearly crushed me over the past several years. Kevin's employer didn't wait long to make their own decision about his future with their company. His termination was officially confirmed less than 10 days after the court verdict was announced. Word spread quickly through his professional industry, and several business partnerships that he had been relying on were quietly pulled or terminated. My parents, now unable to cover the mounting legal fines, back rent payments, and other financial penalties that had been imposed by the court, were forced to list their house for sale. The property went on the market under urgent circumstances, and they had to accept a below-market offer just to generate the cash they needed to pay their legal obligations. The case received additional coverage from local news outlets after the final verdict was announced. One headline read, "Engineer Fights Back, Wins Landmark Family Fraud Case." The story was picked up by financial blogs, consumer rights forums, and legal newsletters as a significant example of long-term fraud that had been hidden behind normal family dynamics for years. After everything was completely finalized in the legal system, I decided to book a solo trip abroad. I didn't make any detailed plans, I didn't bring my work phone, and I didn't tell anyone where I was going or when I would be back. I just wanted some space to breathe air that wasn't connected to paperwork, courtrooms, or news headlines. When I returned home from that trip and walked back into the house that I'd built for myself, a house that was completely untouched by their manipulation and free from their influence, I didn't feel overwhelming bitterness about what had happened. I didn't feel triumph or vindication either. What I felt was clarity. Pure, simple clarity about who I was and what I had accomplished on my own terms. People talk a lot about forgiveness like it's the only finish line that matters in situations like this. They act as if forgiveness is some kind of mandatory destination that you're supposed to reach in order to be considered a good person or to have properly moved on from trauma. But here's what I've learned through this entire experience. Forgiveness is a gift, not a duty. It's something you choose to give freely, not something that's owed to people who have repeatedly harmed you and shown no genuine remorse for their actions. Forgiveness isn't owed to people who keep stealing your name, your identity, and your financial future every time you try to rebuild and move forward with your life. Throughout this entire legal battle, my family asked me repeatedly to forgive and forget what had happened. They wanted me to just let everything go and pretend that years of systematic fraud and identity theft were just minor family disagreements that we could all laugh about someday. But I chose something completely different from what they were asking for. I chose to remember everything that had happened. Every forged signature, every fraudulent account, every lie they told about me to extended family members, every time they rewrote history to make me look like the problem. I chose to remember it all. And more importantly, I chose to make absolutely sure that nothing like this could ever happen to me again. My decision wasn't about holding grudges or being vindictive. It was about establishing clear, non-negotiable boundaries and protecting myself from people who had proven over and over again that they couldn't be trusted with access to my life. Some people might look at my choice and think it's harsh or unforgiving. They might believe that I should have given my family another chance, or that I should have found a way to rebuild our relationships after the legal case was over. But those people don't understand what it's like to spend years of your life cleaning up financial messes you never created, having your credit destroyed by people who were supposed to love and protect you, or discovering that your own family members had been systematically stealing your identity while simultaneously telling everyone else that you were the untrustworthy one. They don't know what it feels like to realize that the people who raised you have been lying about you for years, excluding you from family events and group communications, and then acting surprised when you keep your distance from their dysfunction. The truth is that some relationships can't be repaired, and some trust can't be rebuilt. When people show you through their consistent actions over many years that they view you as a resource to be exploited rather than a person to be respected, believing them the first time can save you a lot of additional pain. I didn't walk away from my family because I'm incapable of forgiveness or because I enjoy conflict. I walked away because I finally understood that protecting myself from further harm was more important than maintaining relationships with people who had proven they would hurt me whenever it was convenient for them. The legal victory was important, and getting my financial life restored was crucial for my future. But the real victory was much more personal than that. The real victory was learning to trust my own judgment about what I was experiencing, even when other people tried to convince me that I was being dramatic or oversensitive. The real victory was refusing to accept gaslighting and manipulation as normal family dynamics that I should just learn to tolerate. The real victory was building a life for myself that was completely separate from their chaos, lies, and financial schemes. Today, my credit is excellent. My career is thriving. I own my home outright, and I've built strong, healthy relationships with people who respect boundaries and treat me with genuine care and honesty. I haven't spoken to any member of my immediate family since the trial ended, and I have no plans to change that in the future. Some people think that's sad, but I think it's one of the healthiest decisions I've ever made. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently choose to harm you, regardless of whether those people happen to share your DNA. Family isn't just about blood relations or shared history. Real family is about mutual respect, honesty, support, and genuine care for each other's well-being. By that definition, the people who stole my identity and spent years lying about me were never really family at all. They were just people who happened to be related to me and who used that relationship as a weapon to manipulate and exploit me for their own benefit. I don't regret the legal battle, even though it was exhausting and emotionally draining. I don't regret cutting contact with them, even though some people think I should have tried harder to preserve those relationships. What I do regret is not trusting my instincts sooner. I regret giving them so many chances to do the right thing when they had already shown me repeatedly who they really were. If I could go back and give advice to my younger self, I would say, when people show you through their actions that they don't respect you, believe them the first time. Don't waste years of your life hoping they'll change or trying to prove that you deserve better treatment. Just build a better life without them, and don't look back. That's exactly what I did, and it's the best decision I ever made. TLDR, discovered my family had been systematically stealing my identity for nearly a decade, opening credit cards, forging signatures, using my information for business accounts, and removing me from family property deeds while telling everyone I was the problem child who had abandoned them. After uncovering evidence of extensive fraud, I sued them, won $195,000 in damages, exposed their lies, and cut contact permanently. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is walk away from people who consistently choose to harm you, even if they're family.